Hello, everybody. Hello.
Rabbi,
The birthday boy is here.
the birthday boy is here.
Did you do something good for your birthday today?
Yeah, we went to Disneyland.
I would have accepted almost anything as
We had the first time that we had not a home cooked meal.
oh,
And
was it a good meal?
it was chicken, barbecue chicken.
Mm-hmm.
But my sister and brother-in-law and my niece and her kids came up, drove by and sang happy birthday to me.
Yeah, I saw that. I saw that on your
Oh, did you? Yeah.
social media this morning. I've been so busy today that I haven't had a chance to go through everything. I think people saw that we posted up about our Israel. We got everything lined up for our Israel.
That sounds like it.
Which is really cool. We've got we got a really good event for that. I think I was surprised that the consul general had the ability to do that day. I mean, I've gotten to know him a little bit over the last couple of months, but I'd hardly say. I mean, like we're friendly. I mean, I can call him, but I was really surprised. Number one, that he agreed to do it so easily, and that he also wasn't booked up already. You know, I was really thinking that I'd have a hard time getting him to come. So
I bet you'll get a lot of people. You know, House was there on last night.
I did. I saw that a couple times the last few times.
Yeah.
He's jumped on, and I'm glad. I'm hoping we'll get people from CBS and Chabad. We had a lot of people from Chabad on last night from Margot.
Oh, did you? Okay.
A lot of people know her from there, and that went considering really smoothly. It was actually hard to do it the way we did it. Having two people in the same room and doing a Zoom at the same time is really hard because you get feedback, and
Yeah.
it's really hard. There are ways to do it if you have mics and more people, and I mean, but I would have had to have like another person there to help me, and I didn't want to be in her room in the first place. I really wanted her to be safe, and at first I wanted to do it with me in my home and her in her home, and then she said, no, please come over and help me. And then I agreed to do it if we did it outside, and then at the last minute she said, I don't want to do it outside, I want to do it indoors. And then I said, fine, but we'll have to stay on the other end of the table. And we ended up we were able to do it, but it's actually harder than you'd think.
I bet.
I think it would have actually been easier if we had been in different places and done it that way. But she was really happy with the way it went.
Good.
And
Where does she live, Mark?
she lives in Valencia Hills area. So for those that are just jumping on, I was talking about last night's event with Margot Webb. So she lives up off of one of those it's a beautiful townhome, nice view up off of Valencia Hills, up in that Valencia Summit area, off of Brighton is the street she lives off of, and it's really nice. It's a beautiful, beautiful place there, and it was a beautiful day. We could have done it outside. I timed it. I wanted to do it at about that time so that we could have gone outside and had natural light. But look, in the end, it was look, I mean, I hope she doesn't get, I mean, my main thing is I just don't want her to get sick. And she was really happy with it. And she had family that were able to watch it. And it was really nice. I mean, she has family that lives all around the country. And so it was nice for them to be able to see her do it,
92 years old. How sharp is she? Oh, man.
Unbelievable.
Unbelievable. Really.
I'm telling you.
Sarah and I were talking about that regarding our mothers. Unbelievable.
You can't explain it. I mean, we had, I just saw Joy Schulman just texted me, and she's not quite 90, but as everybody knows, Lee Schulman was coming to our classes 6 months ago. He was in our every Wednesday, was driving himself down to the class.
Yep. Every Wednesday.
95, 94, 95. And the funny thing was about 2 years ago, he decided he was going to start driving for Uber. and he was an Uber driver for a couple.
Was he really?
90 years old. I'm not kidding.
There's a lot to talk about with a guy like that.
Of
Right?
course. I mean, I
But
said
he was as sharp as can be. I mean, he cracked jokes faster than I could.
he had an amazing sense of humor, amazing mind. But I said, you know, Lee, really pushing it into driving shared rides is a little too much. But he didn't do it for very long. I'm glad he decided not to. So we're gonna give people another minute or so to jump on. We've got an interesting night. I just reminded people on Facebook that tonight is one of the most relevant Torah portions we could probably have. I know our birthday man Mike is already ready to go with, and I want people to jump in as we're reading today. For those who've read this portion before, this is an amazing portion about illness and about quarantining and literally how do you keep the community healthy? How do you respect people's dignity? And how do you balance the health of an individual against the health of a community? So, I mean, this portion speaks to us in a very, very real way today. And again, we'll start in just a minute. We're about to go live on Facebook as well, and allow people to join us here. So we are gonna start, and I know we're gonna have some people joining us, and I'd almost rather, when we do things live, to have people join us late live. It's easier because sometimes I don't notice people joining, and I have to admit them in. I guess there's a setting where I can have them just come in, but I think for safety of our community, we're told to admit people, but sometimes I don't see it in the middle of the text. Sometimes don't see the people coming in. So
you have to admit them, Mark. You have to admit when people go into it, they just go on video and they're
no. There's a way to. There's a way to stop it from, like, people can automatically come in.
Oh, right.
I was warned not to do that. There have been so many cases of people bombing, as they call it, Zoom bombing Jewish events, that I got to tell you something. I'm most worried about it next week when we do our Israel event, because of the amount of anti-Israel folks out there that I'm a little worried about. I'm worried about that event, but we'll see. We are going to publicize it, and we hope everybody joins us again. So for the people who came late, next Tuesday night at 7:00, we're going to have the Consul General of Israel joining us for Yom Ha'atzmaut celebration, and we'll have a chance to ask him some questions. He'll be there, and if you have any questions you'd like to ask him in advance, text them to me, send them to me, email them to me, and I'll get them to you, and we can ask. I'll make sure we get it in there. But I have some questions I want to talk to him. I think everybody's interested to know what's going to go on with the Israel government. They just signed a unity deal. They're going to enter into a power sharing arrangement. The two largest parties are going to be able to form a government that's going to be hopefully a very stable government. And I want to ask him more specifically right now about what's going to go on with corona treatment. And a lot of people are hearing about vaccines and treatments that are coming out of Israel, and we're going to talk a little bit about that too. So his English is impeccable. Just so you know, the last two consul generals in Los Angeles were both Americans. We had David Spiegel, who was from New Hampshire, and Consul General Grunweiler, who was from Florida. So the last two guys have been Americans, obviously spoke pretty good English. Hillel Newman, our new Consul General since last year, he's from South Africa, so he speaks English pretty well too. So he's a very interesting guy, and he'll be there next Tuesday. So we're gonna jump in to the
Mark,
text.
excuse me 1 second. Let me ask you a technology question. How many people do you show are participating right now?
Right now, I show 7 participants, 7 computers.
Okay, so I got the full screen. I got it.
So you've you were actually coming on like on two different places.
No, I had my tablet on. Not anymore.
No,
right?
no.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So, and this, by the way, I mean, I don't mind. It's a nice group, but this is actually our smallest group we've had so far since we've gone online. So I hope people are not completely getting tired of this, especially tonight, because as I said, this is a time for us to actually read a portion that, well, I'm going to tell you right now, because we're going to jump into it. And again, as people come in late, that's on them, because we're starting about 10 minutes late, which, by the way, for those who come every week, know that's about the time we actually get down to business. It takes us usually about that time. So we're going to start today, Tazria Metzora. It's a double portion, which means it's actually two portions that are combined. And sometimes they're split up. In some years, we need to split them up because we have a different amount of weeks depending on the Jewish year, right? Some years we have 2 months of Adar, and so we need to have extra Torah portions to help us through those years. That happens about not quite every 7 year. Every 3 years, but about 7 out of 19 years. So it's a little bit more than every 3 years we have an extra month. So we need 4 portions for that. And then depending on when the holidays fall, sometimes we have holiday portions on Shabbat and sometimes we don't. And so that's why we need these extra portions. So sometimes they get doubled up, as they are this week. And the reason we double them up is because they're shorter and because they're on the same theme. They have to have both qualities, and then we can have them doubled up. So Tazria Metzora, today we're starting in chapter 12. And I want to tell you something. When we talk about what makes the Torah different, what makes it different than any other holy book, what makes it different from the Christian Bible, what makes it different than the Quran, what makes it different than Hindu scriptures and Buddhist holy books, this portion is the greatest example of what makes the Torah different. Today, you're going to see why the Torah is different from every other holy book that we have. Because it's not just a narrative. It's not just laws. It's not just, I want to say mythology. It's actually something very, very special in that it is a guide to everyday life. It is literally a blueprint for how to keep alive, how to stay healthy, how to live, and not just in an esoteric way, not just in a philosophical way, not just in a sometimes beautifully poetic, lyrical way, in a practical, what do you do to stay alive? This is this week's Torah portion. And so Tazria Metzora is something you don't find in other holy books. It's not always fun to read. It's as I've said almost every year when we study this portion, it is a portion of dealing with illness, dealing with medical examination and evaluation and quarantine. It's not a great portion to have when you're a bar or bat mitzvah. It is not fun. It is difficult to read without kind of thinking about issues that are not maybe as easy to pick out relevant lessons for in some years. But this year, it is very powerful. I'm surprised, by the way, and I looked over the last couple of days to see what kind of Torah insights people have been writing on this portion. So far, as of Wednesday, as of today, I'm disappointed actually that more people didn't write about this. I read, for example, Rabbi Sachs, one of the rabbis I like to read every week, is the former chief rabbi from England, who writes great Torah insights. I was surprised he didn't deal with it. He talked about he had a beautiful Devar Torah. It was about he brought in Mr. Rogers, the movie that was just made about Fred Rogers, Tom Hanks. But I kept waiting for him to talk about Corona, and he didn't. And again, it's also nice not to read something about that occasionally over these days too. But this is a once in a lifetime opportunity to derive meaning for today, right now, at this moment, from the Torah. And so I'm a little surprised that more people have not been writing about it because it's a direct correlation. The last time this Torah portion has spoken to us in the same way was, I will tell you, during the time of the kind of the height of the AIDS crisis in the 90s, late 80s, early 90s to the mid 90s. This portion during those times, and for a good 10 years, everybody who talked about this Torah portion from maybe, probably about 84, 85 to 95, you couldn't read this portion without thinking about the AIDS crisis in this country and in the world. But in the last 20, 25 years, it's kind of receded back to that portion of like when a bar mitzvah gets it, or when that person has to write a Devar Torah, or the rabbi has to give a sermon about this week. It's not always easy. It's not an easy one. But with that, let's jump in. The portion begins. The first 5 words are the way we have a lot of sentences begin, a lot of verses in the Torah. Vaydaber Adonai el Moshe lemor. God spoke to Moses. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the Israelite people." We still haven't gotten to the word Tazria. So we go, Daber el b'nei Yisrael lemor, Isha, which means a woman, and then Ki Tazria. And here's where we get the word, the name of the portion. Ki Tazria. When she gives birth. Or when she's in childbirth, and then the next word is, and then she gives birth. When a woman is at childbirth and bears a male, she shall be unclean 7 days. She shall be unclean at the time of her menstrual impurity, as the time that she's menstruating. So, on the 8th day, the flesh of his foreskin shall be circumcised, so the boy goes through a circumcision. But then it says, interestingly, she shall remain in a state of blood purification for 33 days. She shall not touch any consecrated thing, nor enter the sanctuary until the period of her purification is completed. Let's pause right there. Let's just talk about what happens here at the beginning of the portion. So the portion begins with a discussion about what happens to a woman when she gives birth, and the fact that she becomes, as the Torah translates it, but again, we're going to see this word many times in this portion, that she is tameh, that she is unclean. That's the translation of the word tameh, which is interesting because the word in English, unclean, and obviously the opposite, clean, which in Hebrew is tahor, those words are not quite what the Hebrew word means. Clean and unclean, when we talk about those words in English, we're talking about usually something that is sanitary, something that is has been washed and made fit for, oftentimes we would say, to be touched or to be consumed. That when something's clean, we generally think of clothing or a surface, and we say that thing is clean. And it helps us know that it's okay to come around that, or that's ready to wear. But in the Torah, what we're talking about are people. Oftentimes, we'll talk about the word tahor and tameh when it comes to sacrifice and things that are happening in the temple. But here is simply about the woman who gave birth, that she is in a state of impurity or uncleanliness or uncleanness. What the Torah tells us right off the bat is that this has to do with the fact that she has literally had a discharge of blood. She's had blood leave her body, and it's from the same area that she would normally menstruate. And it's in that process, which we also read in the Torah, when a woman is menstruating, that she's ritually, or from the standpoint of religiously, impure. She's unclean. She is, again, to use a better word, the Hebrew word, she's tameh. She's not ready to be part of she can't be part of the community, and she can't do certain things that would affect the rest of the community. And what it says specifically, the words here are specific. She shall not touch any consecrated thing, nor enter the sanctuary until her period of purification is completed, until she's become tahor. So
This is if she's had a boy. Is that correct?
exactly. So you've already got to the next point.
But Rabbi,
yes,
I have a problem with the word sanctuary. Can you explain that?
yeah. So let's look at that,
Because it's not what we call a sanctuary.
no. And so what the word that's used for sanctuary here is the word that's used here is not the word used for an altar. It's not the word used for the Mishkan. And so it seems to imply that it's not just the area where the sacrifices were given, which is why it doesn't use those words, that we normally would have. It says Hamikdash, which we use later for the Beit Hamikdash, for the temple, but it's not the right word. It's not the word that I won't say right word. It's not the word that we normally use for the tabernacle, for the Mishkan, or for the altar, for the Mizbeach, or for the sacred precinct, which is the words that we saw, for example, in Exodus. So this is a different type of word, which is why they translate it as do not enter into the sanctuary. It clearly, the word mikdash, we know means holy. It's a holy area. And so the words in both places are bechol kodesh, in anything that's consecrated, or again, it's a fancy way of saying holy, anything that's kodesh, and that she is not allowed to come into the sanctuary. So clearly, these things that have been sanctified, that have been made holy, they're worried about her coming near. It does not say that she can't go into a house, that she can't be, that she can't do other things that, would be, making food, going to the well. It doesn't say she can't live during those days, but it does say that she is in a situation, again, not trying to use the word impure or unclean, but she's in a state that will render things, if she touches them, also tameh, that she has the ability to give that status, that state, to something else. And as we mentioned the last couple of weeks, the book of Leviticus, from this point on, is very concerned. The first few weeks, it talks about what the priests are supposed to do. The first two portions, last portion, Shmini, was that crazy portion where the sons of Aaron are killed, Nadav and Avihu, and then the laws of Kashrut move us into this time of, okay, we understand we're supposed to be holy, pure. We don't want to be like Nadav and Avihu. We don't want to make any mistakes. We know that we can make the temple, well, we actually haven't gotten to that yet. We're going to read in the portion right after this. We're going to read an Achrei Mot, what we do to re-clean, re-purify the temple. But we can get back to that status, but how do we stop ourselves from ever being in a status where we're going to make a mistake and where we're going to be tameh? Well, the problem for a woman is that it's going to happen to her every month, and it's going to happen to her when she has a son and when she has a daughter. And as you're going to see, because you already jumped a little bit and you know where it's going to go, if she bears a female, she shall be unclean 2 weeks as during her menstruation, and she shall remain in a state of blood purification for 66 days. So you can see that it doubles both the period that she's kind of unclean and also this period where blood has also rendered her in a state where she's not able to do certain things. There are two states: the state of being tameh, and then there's also the state of being in a blood in where they said in need of blood purification. They're two different things, and one of them is more immediate and one of them lasts longer. But it's interesting to note that both of them essentially you have to go through a process of cleansing in order to get out of that state. Now, again, you could say it doesn't really seem fair that this is on women, but the reality is that it's a recognition that women are the ones who brought life into the world. They're definitely in a situation where we recognize that they have done something very holy, very special. And it's really more like we're recognizing that the body, this woman's body has come into contact with kind of the ultimate of creation, the ultimate of life that is almost, it almost needs to have a period of realignment, because it's so big. It's become so, it's rendered her a different person. And it's not that it's evil either. It's that it's so powerful that she's literally become something that if she comes into contact with other things, she's going to pass it on to other things as well. And I think it's also this recognition that blood does have the ability to carry disease. And there's a susceptibility that comes with this status, this state that she's in. So keep in mind that why this is kind of obvious is that when she gives birth to a daughter, the time limits are doubled, because essentially now she's brought into the world a woman who can also one day create life.
Mark, excuse me.
Yeah.
Did you already say, and I didn't hear, why is it 33 days and 66 days?
No. So I will get into.
Sorry, go ahead.
I will get into a month. So if you look at what 33 days represents, we know that 30 days is, even in the biblical period, was a month, and they had the same time. This again, for much of the time, Jews have been following a lunar calendar, which is basically 29 days to the lunar calendar, the lunar month. But 30 days is roughly what a month is. 33 days, therefore, is the 30 days plus 10% more. And they understood that. They understood that 33 was a month plus 3 extra days, 3 bonus days, if you will. It comes out to, it comes out to the 30 days of protection and then like an extra 10%. And it's interesting because we see that concept in the Torah and other places where we have like a bonus period or an extra day. We actually just read it. For example, in the 8 days that we go from a bris, that's a day plus a bonus day. I mean, it's literally like we have a week and then we're going to go for one extra, in one extra day. We're going to give it an extra, kind of I would say kind of a protection period more than a bonus period. That this is like, we're going to give it a 10% extra, an extra protection. The Torah doesn't say anywhere, hey, this is why it's 33 versus 30. But I think when you see that that concept elsewhere in the Torah, including in that exact line, that you see that 10% there, that becomes the basis for then having 66 days, the double period for the women. It's nothing other than the week of Tameh is 7 days, and then the week for becomes 2 weeks, and then the 33 days becomes 66 days. I will tell you, I was thinking about this. I saw Philip just jumped on. This issue of purification and specifically women going through this period of impurity is something that is in this New television program that's on Netflix, Unorthodox. Have many people seen it yet? I don't. Just you can chime in. Take yourself.
What's it called? What's it called?
Unorthodox.
No.
Anybody? I know some people.
I think it's amazing.
So do you remember the underwear thing?
Yes.
Mhm.
And she also shaves her head. Why does she do that?
Well, that's an issue of, again, wearing a wig so that she doesn't have to. She's not going to cover her hair. Some people cover their hair. In many Hasidic Jewish circles, it's recommended or required to shave so that they can put on a wig after that. But do you remember the underwear thing in particular? I was getting on that because that's the issue of impurity.
Well, they have separate beds in their bedroom.
That too, but I thought there was, maybe I'm forgetting and mixing it up with something else that was on TV lately. But there was this issue of
There's only four. There's only four.
she had to look in her underwear to make sure she was not bleeding anymore. Was that in it? Well,
I haven't seen that. I haven't seen that episode yet.
no, it might have been in a different, and it might have been in a different. It might have been in a different thing. I might be conflating two different shows, but this is a real issue within continuously an issue of within the Orthodox world, which is women need to make sure that after they're done with menstruation, that they wait a week, and that they're still. Wait a second. The 100% was in it. Now you're making me go crazy, you two.
No.
I think in the first episode, because there's this issue. Wasn't there an issue with that she wasn't allowed? She was supposed to be in bed with him only during those 2 weeks of.
Yes.
She was being taught. She gets a lecture from the woman who comes over and gives her sex tips.
Yes, that's exactly what happens. The woman comes over and tells her, basically explains sex to her.
Yeah. So the issue is the Torah says that a woman has to be clean and not menstruating in order for her to essentially, again, be out of the state of being tameh. And I keep saying the word tameh because I don't like to use the word unclean, which is the English translation. It's really a pejorative term, and I don't like using it, but again, so I'm going to say tameh. So this is a big issue. And so rabbis are often called upon, again, thank God I'm not an Orthodox rabbi, they're called upon to judge whether a woman's menstrual, or I wouldn't say menstrual discharge, but a discharge later on in the month, whether it is, whether it was really menstruation or not, because if she menstruated, then you have to wait another week after that in order to have sex. So, and so if a woman just had a discharge that wasn't blood, then the rabbi basically says, hey, this isn't menstruation and she's okay. She's not tameh. Literally, rabbis have to look at underwear. So as I said, I am very grateful that has never happened to me and shall never happen to me. It sounds like a really nightmare of Tom Jones or something, but it's.
I'd rather work in this, Hyperion plant.
No, I would tell you this has thankfully not ever been part of my job description and never shall be. But I don't even want to. Yes, it's not. There's nothing to me. There's nothing. I mean, it's just not something I'd ever. It's horrible actually to think about. But listen, this was an important law, and it does help women to not be in a situation where they are essentially where their husbands are not, where they're not able to have marital relations, to say it in a euphemistic way. But here's the thing. What this also does, and it touches on this in Orthodox, by having that week of not having sex after menstruation, it almost forces people to be having sex during the time when the woman is ovulating. So what it does is it basically cuts off the 2 months to 2 weeks out of a month that a woman is ovulating, I mean, not ovulating, and basically says that we're restricting you to have sex during the time when she's most likely going to be pregnant. And again, this isn't science. There's not necessarily something super scientific about it. It's not folk science. I don't want to say that it's made up stuff. It actually does increase your chance for sure to be pregnant, but it's not. If you went to an infertility specialist, they wouldn't tell you to wait necessarily exactly a week. They would say, look, we have to take your temperature. We have to, people ovulate at different times. But all things being equal, for 1 million people, this is the way to most increase the chance that somebody will be pregnant. Philip, did you want to say something? Yes? Philip?
Oh yeah, in the show, Unorthodox,
Mm-hmm.
in the show, there's also a scene where she's not getting pregnant, and they, even though they're Orthodox, ultra Orthodox, they would use IVF. That I found that interesting.
Yeah. Oh no, it is a. Listen, we're talking about it in a little bit in our Tuesday morning class. Infertility amongst the Jewish community is biblical. We know that Sarah, Rebecca, and Rachel all had a difficult time having a pregnancy, and so the Torah gives us a very very quickly we jump into this issue of fertility, and the Torah essentially, because these women finally miraculously have children, doing anything, and to us in our generation, it's very expensive and it's somewhat miraculous still. To use fertility treatments is 100% acceptable within the Orthodox world, because there really is no greater, as you can see from that movie, there's no greater blessing than to have a child, and the pressure to have children is also immense in the Orthodox world as well. And in some cases, people are literally forced to get divorced if they're having problems. If they're having problems becoming pregnant, and there is no logical reason why or physical reason why that it's happening, they sometimes kind of come to the conclusion that these people just are not compatible. And so this is a real issue. And so the first part of Tazria really deals with this, the what happens with the woman who's pregnant. It really doesn't have anything to do with the man at all. It says that on the completion of purification for either a son or a daughter, you shall bring to the priest at the tent of meeting a lamb in its first year for a burnt offering, and a pigeon or a turtle dove for a sin offering. Which again doesn't mean that she sinned. It's kind of more of a protection. And interestingly enough, we have a kind of a version of this, even kind of a example of this in the Christian Bible, where we learn of Mary going through a period of cleansing after she gives birth. It's interesting that this was something that kind of stood out, even in the ancient world amongst Jews, that women would go through this ritual, which again, it's not one. I want to make it very clear. This is not women are impure and they're unholy, or there's something wrong with them. It really is almost, and again, I know it seems that way, and I don't think I'm making excuses for this here. I don't think I'm trying to reread the Torah here and make it nicer than it really is. It really is this understanding that a woman who's given birth is almost like a priest, is almost like somebody who's engaged in the ultimate act of holiness, and like a priest needs to go through a purification in order to kind of re-enter the community after going through the act of coming so close, if you will, to God. And I really do think that that's what's going on here.
The mikvah, correct?
So today a woman goes through a mikvah because after she has gone through after she's gone through her her period of no longer leading. Now I'm trying to think what movie had a mikvah scene in it recently. Oh, it was that Unorthodox again. They had her going to a mikvah,
Yeah.
right? But there was something
Rabbi?
else I saw recently with a woman who was not Jewish, who was converting, and it showed her going to a mikvah. I can't remember. I don't know.
Rabbi?
Yeah.
How does a woman go to a mikvah now with COVID-19? How do the Orthodox, how would
It's a
you deal
great
with that?
question. It's a great question. So there's a so let me answer this question in the way that it's been reported on so far. Some of you actually may have heard this. There were a question of how could you keep it open with what's going on now, and they were keeping them open. They were keeping the mikvah open, and there was a question of whether maybe I would say the less orthodox versions of Judaism, or the least exacting orthodox or religious groups would allow it, but synagogues have been closed, JCCs have been closed. Kosher butchers, by the way, have stayed open because they're supplying food, right? And the other Jewish institution that has stayed open have been mikvahs. So I will tell you, let me answer it this way. There are not a lot of non-Orthodox women that go monthly to the mikvah, but I want to be real careful when I say this. That's not every non-Orthodox woman. There are non-Orthodox women, let's put it that way. I don't really know how to say this without negatives in it. There are progressive women that go to the mikvah in addition. The problem is that the places where you would go if you are a progressive mikvah person, those places have been closed down. So the Orthodox mikvahot have stayed open, and the progressive places have shut down. So it is a problem. So let me give you an example. The main time that I take people to mikvah, my daughters, by the way, without getting too personal, they do not go to mikvahs on a monthly basis, but they all went to a mikvah before their bat mitzvah. So before they celebrated bat mitzvah, we did a mikvah ritual with them. And I didn't go in with them, but I was there. I was on the premises at the AJU where they went into the mikvah. The only other time that I go to that mikvah is when I officiated conversions. That mikvah is shut, and so there are no conversions going on right now within the conservative and the reform movement that uses that mikvah. So this is this is an issue, not so much I would say for people who, I'm trying to think. I think I had, one second since we got on this topic. I think I have a mikvah scheduled in. I have a mikvah scheduled in. Hold it one second. I have a mikvah scheduled, I think, in June. It might have been in May.
You should be okay for that.
I don't know, but that is, that I just thought about that. That's a tough thing to have to miss out on that too. I mean, obviously weddings and bar mitzvahs, we're dealing with that right now. But that's a tough one too. I mean, people who've been looking forward to that for a long time. But I'm sure, again, they'll be reopened and wow. Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm trying now that it's just interesting. I just suddenly started thinking about that when you guys brought that up, but I think it was in May. Anyways, sorry, I just got off the topic, but it is an interesting it's an interesting thing to think about what has been closed down there. So that's a good point there, folks. So let's continue on though. We're going to go into, I do want to point out, a woman who can't afford, this is this last verse of chapter 12. If she does not have the means, right, she cannot afford a sheep, she could take 2 turtle doves or 2 pigeons, one for a burnt offering and one for a sin offering. The priest shall make expiation on her behalf. She shall be clean. She shall be tahor. So again, it's a nice thing that the Torah tells us that that a woman did not, if she couldn't afford one sacrifice, she could offer up another sacrifice. So it's kind of one of those things too that the Torah, that the Torah kind of gives us a this option, if you will. I want to point out too that the Christian Bible, when it talks about Jesus being born, I like to point this out. It says in the book of Luke, when the days of their purification according to the laws of Moses were fulfilled, they brought him up to Jerusalem to present him to the Lord, where it says, as it is written in the law, every male who opens the womb shall be called holy to the Lord, and to offer a sacrifice according to that which is of the Lord, a pair of turtle doves or 2 young pigeons. So what it tells us is that Mary offered up the less expensive offering for Jesus. Again, it's not any slight on her. I mean, we don't know that she could afford it, right? Her husband was a carpenter. He maybe wasn't making as much money as other people in the community. So it's interesting that the Christian Bible actually recounts a story of exactly what the Torah tells us that you're supposed to do when you have a baby. So it's interesting too, because Luke is the least Jewish of the, well, not the least Jewish, but the least Jewish of the 3 main Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. He's the least Jewish of them, and he recounts this very interesting story of Jesus's mother having to offer up a sacrifice, like the Torah tells us. So again, the 2 turtle dove one. So let's take a look at chapter 13. Let's move into the next part of this, which is, again, now the part that really is relevant to us, which is what happens on our bodies. And it says, when the Lord spoke to Moses saying, when a person has on the skin of his body a swelling, a rash, or a discoloration, and it develops into a scaly affection on the skin of his body, it shall be reported to Aaron the priest, or to one of his sons, the priests. The priest shall examine the affection on the skin of the body. If hair in the affected patches turn white, and the affection appears to be deeper than the skin of the body, it is a leprous affection. When the priest sees it, he shall pronounce him unclean, which again is the word tameh. So again, this seems to, again, the word tameh, same word used for the woman, this seems to be something more than just physically unclean. This is something where there is something going on here that is on a spiritual plane. Does anybody want to be the first to say what we always say when we get to this portion? Anybody? Somebody be the first.
Say what? About what?
It's not leprosy.
Leprosy, right?
It's not leprosy.
But that's how the word was interpreted, wasn't it?
Yeah. So we always use the word leprosy for this. The Hebrew word for it is sarat, which is where we get the Yiddish word surus, difficulties.
Oh, really? Oh.
We say surus is bad stuff, but it comes from the same idea that this is bad stuff. It's not good. I mean, obviously, it's not good to have affection, but this is not leprosy. And how do we know it's not leprosy? Because they did not have leprosy in the land of Israel until hundreds and hundreds of years later. Leprosy was not a disease that came into the country until the time of Alexander the Great. So hundreds of years later, the Greeks brought this disease to the Middle East. So we know it's not leprosy. What is it? Well, there are a lot of theories about what this disease is or what these diseases are, because it doesn't seem to be one disease. But
A supernatural plague.
well, that's what the rabbis see it as. And they also see it as something that could be passed from person to person, so it's contagious. And it's also, importantly, something that you can be cured of, which in the ancient world, leprosy was not one of those things you could be cured of. So leprosy was a serious, serious problem, and was one that, again, we don't want to minimize it. It was a real issue, and we did have it eventually in the land of Israel. By the time of Jesus, there are stories, and again, we're not talking about the New Testament really today, but it is relevant. There are stories of Jesus healing lepers. That is meant to be something pretty wild, because leprosy you do not get healed from. This disease people would get healed from. There is a way for people to get healed, and part of it might have been that they are doing things that are making them they're engaged in behaviors that are giving them these diseases. That's clearly not what was happening in leprosy. Philip, yes.
I want to point out there's also reporting going on. If you get sick in this specific illness, you have to report it to Aaron or one of his sons.
Yes.
So they're gathering information.
Yes.
Even back then.
So even back then, and I think one would actually could make the comment, and not today. We can add that to it.
That's what I was going to say. In
Yes.
other words, here's where I'm going to do a little inferring. So if you go to Aaron or one of his sons, they could say, okay, who have you been around? Who have you met with? Where were you? Trace your movement. If it's contagious. So we don't have that today, although Apple and Google are developing that. There was a good story about it on the CBS Sunday Morning Show, but it will be voluntary.
Yeah. So let's talk about that, because that's probably the most relevant. I don't know if it's the most relevant, but it's definitely one of the most relevant pieces here, is that the people who got this disease had to report. Now, you can make the argument today that with what we're dealing with, and again, it's impossible to read this and not think about what we're dealing with, that we can't force people to report in this country. We know that in other countries, most obviously China, they didn't give people that choice. I want you to know that when you walk into Chinese territory, on a train, on a plane, when you come into Chinese territory, 365 days a year, every single year, every day, you get screened thermally as you're walking into the country. I've been there 4 times in the last 2 years. Every single time, anywhere you come into China, you're scanned thermally as you're coming into the country. They don't care about your civil rights of whether or not you want to be scanned. And if you have a fever, they will pull you out, and you will go through another level of evaluation before you come into the country. Period. End of story. And that's all the time. That's not when Corona is going on. That didn't start, a year ago. And this is an amazing thing to see. And in some cases, I've noticed it because, it sticks out in my head because we don't do this. It's not even just where you'd think it would be. In certain places in the train station, there'll be a screener that you have to walk past that's taking your temperature there. So they do it all the time. And I just want you to know, it's weird for, it's noticeable for us, for people who don't live under that kind of society, but they're serious about it there. and they've always been, I mean, not always, but they've been serious about it since before Corona. That is one of the ways that they kept these diseases in check. Was that as soon as they started seeing people with fevers, they were able to rush to those areas and as you know, lock them down. So the Torah, there is a missing thing here, which is that the priests aren't walking around. It doesn't say the priests are walking around and evaluating the people. It doesn't say that. It doesn't say that the priests are doing that. But it does say when a person has the swelling or the rash, it shall be reported to Aaron. That doesn't mean that the person reported it. It could mean that their friend reported it. It could mean that somebody else reported it. It may mean that the person didn't know, didn't care, that somebody else reported it. But it does say that it is reported. And so while it doesn't say the priests would walk around and scan people indiscriminately, it did mean that people had a responsibility to report. And if the person who was sick didn't report it, their friend, neighbor, cousin could also report it. And not could, was supposed to be reported. It was supposed to be reported. The Torah has a different take on communal responsibility than even our society does today, maybe especially with what our society has. One of the things that's operating in the Torah, and is, I think, a wonderful lesson for us today, which you just read, is that the community's health is most important. The individual's rights are secondary to the community's health. And that goes against some of our inclinations as Americans. It's one of the areas where Jewish law and American law is different, because American law so values the civil rights of an individual, the individual right, that some of these things that would be done even under Jewish law would not be allowed in America. And there is something to be said for those values that have been traditional Jewish values, which are that your rights, your civil rights, are important in Judaism, and Judaism understands the right of an individual, the value, the holiness of an individual. We just kind of read in the same portion how holy a person is. Even an infant is so holy, but not against the rights of the community, not against the health of the community as a whole. That's one of the most important takeaways from this portion. This is what I'd like to see more people talking about within the Jewish community, and with this Torah portion in our minds, and in our parsha, is to think about these values, the way they're weighed against in Judaism. We in our country even today, we don't oftentimes even deal with competing values and with weighing out a situation and think about the truths or the values or the fundamental principles, and how sometimes they come into conflict with each other. Judaism does this all the time. In Judaism, we're constantly confronted, especially in the Torah and then later on in the Talmud, we're confronted with issues that will be juxtaposed intentionally. The rabbis intentionally put situations in front of us in the Talmud where we say, okay, well, this is what we would do in this situation, but what if we're confronted with this dilemma? What if we also are now dealing with something on Shabbat? What if we're dealing with, the value of saving a life versus the right of the community as a whole? What if we're dealing with the rights of a mother versus the rights of the fetus. I mean, these are things that in our society we don't like to deal with. We want, I think, maybe more than any time in history, we want to think about an absolute right that you know, we don't have competing things that we have to weigh. And in Judaism, we force ourselves to look at those. And so these are tough questions. These are tough because we have to weigh two truths and two values and say, yeah, but in this case, this is what we're going to have to do. So based on the Torah, you would report somebody who had an affection, and the priest, based on this, would come in and evaluate them and tell them what would have to happen. It wasn't up to them. Nobody, and what I want to make clear is nobody is saying right now that if somebody has the virus right now, that they have any responsibility or any right to do anything once they have it. I mean, we know that people have been arrested for jeopardizing the health of other people, you know, by spitting or licking on, you know, and even when they don't have it, threatening people. We know that's been put into effect, but we haven't had people arrested who refused to be tested or refused treatment or refused to you know, to comply with even even answering whether they had it or not. So this is very real. This is an issue which, you know, maybe because only a very small fraction of the people who have this disease are going to die of it. But we may be one day confronting an illness, a pandemic, where we as Americans may have our rights. We may not have a choice. I don't know. I'm only speculating and offering this up as an American, and not really talking about it as a Jew, because from the Jewish standpoint, it don't really matter whether you want to report it or not. You have an obligation, and if you don't fulfill that obligation, somebody else can do it for you. Somebody else should do it for you.
This is now the issue of contact tracing, correct?
Yeah, other than the fact that we don't even know what that information is going to mean for us. We don't know. We don't know that this is no. Let's put it this way: we don't know that this is going to. With this virus, we may have averted having that tough discussion about it, and that the discussion will be had offline by people after this is all over. I'm talking about the CDC, you know, maybe people in law enforcement and maybe FBI. I don't Justice Department people will be sitting down and having discussions about, but what happens the next time? Because I will tell you something, there will be a next time. God forbid it should happen in our lifetime. But what we're seeing here, and again, I've talked about this before, I'm hoping that this is a test run and we've learned how to do better next time we have a pandemic that we can't handle with treatment for, again, 96% of the people that are going to survive this disease. I'm talking about a disease, a pandemic that'll kill 30, 40, 50% of the people who get it. I'm talking about more like an Ebola type situation where people, you know, are going to be gone before, you know, and it's not going to be just the most vulnerable in our community. So I hope we learn from this. I hope of all the things that have come out of this is that we as a society are going to do a better job next time, because we didn't do, no matter what you think, we have not done a great job this time. So I hope next time we do, and the next time we may have now the discussion that, again, we're going to have offline, not you and me, but the people who are going to make these decisions in the health organizations and law enforcement organizations are going to have those discussions. You and I probably are not going to be part of those discussions. I don't know that Congress is going to have open hearings and discussions about this afterwards. And I don't even know what even if there's a congressional hearing about what happened that happens next year, who knows what the recommendations will be, and who knows whether that'll just become a political football again, where one administration doesn't want to deal with what a Congress from a different party came up with. So we don't know what this is going to mean. Hopefully the information, the policies, and then the implementation will be done in a non-political way. I'm not entirely hopeful of that, but I'm hoping someone at least documents it. I'm hoping that somebody at least will, in a nonpartisan way, say, hey, this is what really did happen here. And so,
But it's already bringing up ethical and legal issues, the issue of privacy, confidentiality, a duty to warn. This is all being discussed now. That'll end up in the courts.
yes, and some of it, you're right. Some of it will be litigated. There's no question. Some of this will be litigated. So the interesting thing will be to see if we end up, changing some of our laws. Now, but here's the weird thing. If recent history is our guide, we had a whole bunch of stuff that happened to us in our civil rights after 9/11, and the Constitution never got changed, folks. In case you were not paying attention, we haven't amended the Constitution in many, many years, many decades. So we really haven't. So will it be as obvious to us what's happened? Will laws be enacted? Will there be decisions at the highest level in the Supreme Court? Will there be discussions in Congress that are, we don't know. You and I will probably not know. I'm just hoping that whenever this happens the next time, because at the end of the day, you and I can talk about what the law should be and what Congress will do and whatever. The most important thing is the next time this happens, that more lives are spared, and that people, I hope, will learn a little bit about this, and then think about the fact that there's a wisdom to what we just read in the Torah, which is so powerful, that the health of our community as a whole, of our society, the physical health of our community is not something that we take for granted. That we don't just say, yeah, but maybe this will work, maybe this won't work. We start from that point. We start from the point of saying, how do we protect our society? How do we put a guard around our society's health? And then we approach it from, okay, but let's protect, we have to protect people's civil rights. I'm going to tell you, and again, this is the Torah talking, this is Judaism talking. There's a wisdom to this. If everybody is dead, what difference does it make what your constitutional rights are? If you're dead, it doesn't matter. And so that's why there's a wisdom to this, that, again, the principle of, we say life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Liberty, the pursuit of happiness are great, but I'd say the Torah is quite similar to Jefferson, in that what comes first is life. And Judaism was really trying to protect our lives.
You said Jewish law was more concerned about the community than the individual, correct? So now aren't we becoming more concerned about public health versus individual privacy and confidentiality?
Let's see what happens. I'm going to tell you, there are people who are advocating for, restrictions to be lifted based on their civil rights, based on their pursuit of happiness. They want to golf, they want to go to the beach. And one would say that, look, from the Jewish perspective, not from your political rights, not from your state's rights, not from your position on, you don't like this policy. If we follow Judaism here, our first goal is to do everything we can to protect your life, to protect as many lives as possible.
The
That
community.
has to be bigger than your. And again, that's what I would say to somebody you say, give me liberty or give me Corona. I mean, that's kind of, you're kind of being a little funny with that. But if you truly believe that, then I don't want to be your next door neighbor, because I don't want you to be more concerned with your right to go out than my life. And Judaism has, as we've talked about,
say that again, Mark. Say
that your right to go golfing and your right to go out whenever you want is not greater than my right to live. And you can't take my life and gamble with my life because you want to go out and do what you want to do at this moment. Look, I'm a firm believer in not letting this drag on longer than it needs to go. I'm really frustrated, as everybody else is. But I will tell you that I wear a mask when I go out. I'm not openly defying these restrictions, because even if I think that it's overblown and that it doesn't even matter. My society is at stake here. My neighbor's health are at stake, and I can't, as a Jew, take those for granted. So my Judaism very much is informing my behavior right now, and I hope, thankfully, that it informs lots of people's understanding of what they need to do right now in order to be safe and to keep our society safe. The Torah is preeminently concerned with life. So we'll go on a little bit more. Philip, you still have your hand up. Is it still up for before or something else?
No, I think the next part sort of answered my question, because now we're talking about quarantine.
Yes. So if I'll get to that. So if a white discoloration on the skin of the body, which does not appear to be deeper than the skin and the hair, it is not turned white, the priest shall isolate the affected person for 7 days. So 7 days we don't think that it's the really bad version of this, because it's not deeper than the skin, and the hair hasn't turned colors. So we're thinking that this is probably a good version of whatever somebody has. It's the best case scenario, that you probably are going to be able to be quarantined for a week. So the person's isolated for a week. It doesn't exactly say what quarantine look like. So I will tell you that the Torah doesn't tell us exactly what it means to be quarantined, but it does in other parts of the Torah, when we talk about someone being kept out of the camp, it definitely means that they're not allowed to come into public spaces. That's very clear, that coming into a public space is not allowed, which would mean the well, would mean the community areas, the places of assembly, that the people are not allowed to go into those places. And so for 7 days, the person is isolated. And the word that's used here also seems to imply that the person really doesn't come out for 7 days. It's not just that they're by themselves, but that they're by themselves in an area that they're not allowed, that they're not even coming out of that area for 7 days. So if it's a special tent, or if it's a special area, a special house, a special building that they're in, it doesn't seem like it's not just that they're by themselves, but they're in an area that they're alone in that area.
Are we talking about today, or are we talking about?
No, we're talking about, this is the Torah. I mean,
no, but I'm just saying, are we talking about today, or are we talking about biblical times? It's the same conversation, the same language.
Oh, yeah.
Exactly the same language.
Yeah. I mean, we're talking about 2 weeks, nowadays, but we're not done. So on the 7th day, the priest shall examine him again. If the affection is faded and is not spread on the skin, the priest shall pronounce him clean. It is a rash, he shall wash his clothes, he shall be clean. But if the rash is spread on the skin after he has presented himself to the priest, this is the second time, and he's been pronounced clean, he shall present himself again to the priest. And if the priest sees that the rash is spread on his skin, the priest shall announce or pronounce him unclean. It is leprosy. So obviously we're dealing with a situation here that it can come back. And if it comes back, he has to go through this situation again. And what it seems as though is that it is the worst version of this. That it is the version of this that isn't a small reaction. It's not maybe, again, they're explaining that this one that you have your watch for a week, it might not be a disease at all. It could just be a reaction. But here it is this worst case scenario. Continues, when a person has a scaly affection, when their skin is scaly, then they're also reported to the priest. If the priest finds the skin a white swelling, which has turned some hair white, with a patch of undiscolored flesh in the swelling, it is chronic leprosy on the skin of his body, and the priest shall pronounce him unclean. He need not isolate him, for he is unclean. So this seems a strange situation, because it seemed to be talking about a part of the disease where he's no longer contagious. He has a version of a disease that's staying with him, but he no longer can spread it to someone else, and so he doesn't need to be quarantined. So it's almost, again, to use the modern equivalence, that he has the antibodies now. I think that there's a fear here that, again, if a person doesn't get the disease, if the person, maybe the person has the disease or has the antibodies, I think there's still a fear that we have that they may spread it to somebody else, right? That if you come in contact with that person, that somehow they don't have it anymore. They're not going to get a recurrence of it, which, again, I know we don't know that for sure. We don't know for sure that if you have the antibodies, you'll never get it again. They say it's too soon to know. They're hopeful, but they're not sure. But here's the question. If you come into contact with somebody who no longer has it, can they pass that on to you? Can they have the disease, and can they pass it on to you? So I guess the question is, like, if they had it on their clothing, and I'm talking about coronavirus, so if they have this virus, and then you touch them, and even though they no longer are ill, could you get sick from them? I mean, this is a real fear that people have. I'm going to ask a question now. Has anybody come into contact with somebody that they know has already had the disease?
No.
No,
Anybody?
that they know.
No.
They know they've had it. They've been cleared from quarantine or isolation. And if you come into contact with anybody like that yet? Anybody?
No.
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 Okay. I have. And it happened last week. And he's a young guy. He's in his early 30s. And he never had very bad symptoms. He was positive, tested positive for it. And he was not allowed to work. And he worked at Eden. And I had a funeral last Friday, which was not quite a week ago, 5 days ago. And I knew he was sick. I spoke to him actually when he was in quarantine just to check on him. He said he was fine. But then I saw him for the first time on Friday when I think he got cleared back to work maybe a week before, or 5 or 6 days before. Then he came back to work, and the first day that I had seen him was last Friday. And I saw him, he looked fine. I asked him how he was doing. He handed me the information on the deceased. He was the funeral director. And I have to tell you, he handed it to me. You know, it's a piece of paper. And I got to tell you, I was freaked out a little bit. I have to say, I didn't say anything to him, but I immediately went back and put it down. I didn't touch it anymore. I sanitized my hands, and I was like, I don't care what's on there. I'm not looking at it. I don't care if there's a check in there. I'm not looking at it. I don't care if there's a 500, I'm not looking at this. I'm not touching it. I didn't want to touch it. Just so you know, there was a piece of paper, but but I really was scared touching this piece of paper that he had touched. Now, again, he was cleared to go back to work. He didn't have a disease. He didn't have the disease anymore.
Well, Mark, but that doesn't, that's not going with the facts of what we know. It doesn't just enter through the skin, it enters through an opening. That's why they say if you come in contact with your mail or anybody, your clothing, you don't touch your face, you don't touch your eyes, you don't touch your nose, your mouth.
I just did. I hate to do it. I was wiping.
No, but I'm saying you didn't want
No,
to
no,
touch.
but I know.
You
So
catch it just by touching, right? We know that. 20
so
years from now, maybe they'll find out they did. That wasn't true. But right now, it has to go through an opening, an entry.
I know. I have to assume that whatever doctors checked him out, he's at work, he's in a cemetery. I have to assume that he's healthy. But I felt the way the Torah kind of is reminding us, when you see somebody who seems to have the disease, it still freaks you out.
Yeah, that's
Even
true.
if he's, like they say, chronic. The problem is that when you're living with such fear as we are right now, I mean, I'm sitting in my office right now. I've got this right here. I mean, I got sanitizer all over the place. It really has an effect on you. And I think when we read about people's fears in getting these diseases in the ancient world, I mean, they didn't even really understand. I mean, they didn't know what a virus was. They didn't know what bacteria was. So they were very scared, and they tried to do everything they can to protect themselves. But these fears are very real for us once again. And I'm telling you, when we're in the midst of this, and when you and I are dealing with this, and I think these fears are going to be with us for a few months. I think they're going to be with us, obviously, until we're all vaccinated. But the Torah actually tells us, hey, you know what? This is a legitimate concern. And there should be some kind of way of knowing, hey, you're okay with this person. Listen, I got to tell you something. It's not just with Corona. When we deal with illness, and I'm looking at Mary right now. I mean, Mary was a hospice nurse for many years. There is a feeling when you come into contact with something that could kill you, even if it's not contagious, that it's a frightening thing. I mean, death is frightening. Illness is frightening. And I don't think if you're a logical, rational, and caring person, that you don't take that for granted. You don't ever assume that your health is a guarantee. And the Torah tells us that we have to be careful, and that, again, we're not going to be 100% effective, that we're not going to always get it right, but you try. Philip, I see you got something to say.
Two things. One, I've noticed now in society, every time somebody dies, the first question people ask is, was it COVID-19? I mean, even if it's not, everybody asks that.
Yeah.
And then we had a law clerk in the firm who didn't feel well. She took some time off, and she ended up getting tested. She did not have coronavirus, but the owners of the firm were so, freaked out. I don't know what the term is, that they brought in like a hazmat team to just sanitize and clean the entire office. It turned out she had like a little bit of a stomach virus. But It was a big overreaction. Still, they did it.
Listen, I've had four funerals. I've had 4 funerals in the last few weeks, and I've asked, I've asked, and the person that I had a funeral for on Sunday, the person was 99 years old, and they passed away. And it's still, I came up, I didn't, it is at the forefront of our life right now, which is why this Torah portion reminds us that there are times, especially when we see these kinds of diseases, that we are taking precautions, and we're gonna and we're going to evaluate it. So the Torah continues with different things that look like this. It says, if the discoloration remains stationary, not having spread, it is the scar of inflammation. The priest shall pronounce him clean. When the skin of one's body sustains a burn by fire and the patch from the burn is a discoloration, either white, streaked, or red or white, the priest shall examine it. If some of the hair has turned white in the discoloration, which itself appears to go deeper than the skin, it is leprosy that is broken out in the burn. The priest shall pronounce him unclean. It is a leprous affection. But if the priest finds that there is no white skin in the discoloration and that it is not lower than the rest of the skin, and it is faded, the priest shall isolate him 7 days. So it's telling us that there's sometimes diseases or situations where people will get similar reactions to this, and you have to be careful. But if we look at it very carefully, we're going to say that these people, we're going to make sure that they're okay, rather than say the word unclean, that they're clean and they're able to be a part of society, that they don't have to be isolated. What's interesting here is it says that after a person got burned, they are more susceptible to get this disease, because it says that if a person starts getting this reaction after after they've been burned, then they might have the disease. Even though they've been burned and the discoloration originally might have been the burn, there can be later on discoloration that shows that it's actually the disease. Yeah, Philip.
Yeah, well, they didn't know it at the time, but if you have burns, if you're severely burned, your immune system is compromised.
Yeah, absolutely. But
they would have no way of knowing that.
No, they wouldn't know that that they are compromised, but they would know that you're more. They would understand that an infection can spread in an area that's been burned or damaged. So they did know that I actually may have passed over some kind of thing that was from I might have skipped over a part that was. No, it didn't say. It just said the inflammation. So again, sometimes people would get reactions, or they get wounds. A wound that would not be originally would not be the disease, but then it could be. Let's look at this other part though here. Let's skip ahead a little bit to.
Mark, why was it left to the Kohen? Weren't there medical people, healers in the Bible? Anybody?
Well, there were. And definitely by the Talmudic period, the time of the Talmud, by the time of the rabbis were writing, there were definitely doctors. The idea of a professional class of people that were doctors definitely existed by the time of the Talmud. It's most likely that folk remedies and that an idea that you had to go to somebody who was skilled in medicine might have been more for the most extreme cases of things. One of the things that's important in this discussion that we have in the Torah is that these are diseases that are not unique and limited to one person. These are diseases that afflict a community. Now, the rabbis go on to talk about, and again, in years when we're not dealing with an epidemic, we sometimes talk about where the rabbis will interpret why people get this, which is that there's a spiritual component to it. In most years we talk about, and again, this was what was surprising about Rabbi Sachs's commentary, is he went with the more traditional standard commentary, which is that this disease of tsarat afflicts people that are engaged in what sin, folks? Somebody give it to me. Somebody tell me.
Gossip.
Yes, thank you. Who was that?
Hi, it's Daniela.
Daniela, very good. By the way, I just want to point out that Daniela is one of our youngest. I think it's safe to say is actually the youngest person on this call, but thank you for being here, Daniela. Yes, Daniela is 100% right. That this is a disease that the rabbis connect most definitely with gossip and saying bad things about people. They actually say that the disease, Metzora, is a compound of the word motzi shem ra, saying bad things about people. And Daniela, being somebody who's a younger person and involved in college, and somebody who's much closer to the ground of being a young person in the era of social media, this has not gotten easier, has it, Gossip? Daniela?
Yes.
Has gossip gotten better or worse, do you think, during your generation?
In my generation, it's absolutely gotten worse because there are now websites that you can use to create like fake links to fake news websites. There's the ability to send messages instantaneously via social media. It's honestly a huge mess. Not to mention, like, there are now conspiracy theories about the virus that are actively harming people. It's not just gossip now. It's actively harming people in a much more physical way. It's really bizarre.
Yep. And you've now connected it back to the virus itself, because you're absolutely right. Gossip in this case and false stories is actually creating and will hurt more people. So you're absolutely right. There's gossip that can be applied to here. But we understand that gossip and slander in particular is such a serious, serious issue that it is that when you're punished with this kind of disease, it is a punishment for specifically doing that. But it doesn't just come from this interesting play on the name, the word Metzora. Does anybody know? Maybe Danielle, do you know why there's a Torah basis for that?
I think it's because specifically Miriam spread gossip about Moses' wife and was stricken with this disease.
Absolutely. I'd like to say that I taught Danielle everything that she knows, but I did not. So she's 100% right. We read in the book of Numbers that Miriam, of all people, who was a great person, we only hear really good things about Miriam up until this moment, that she does spread gossip about Moses and his wife. Maybe it was Tzipporah, maybe a different wife. We don't really know. But ironically, coincidentally, tragically, definitely ironically, she speaks about her being the wife being a Cushite, which is another word for a black person. And what happens? She becomes scaly white. That Miriam is stricken with this white scales on her skin. She becomes super white. And so she's hit with Sarat. And what happens is that Moses, at the urging of Aaron, their brother, their common brother, when Aaron says to Moses, please pray on behalf of our sister, heal her, Moses goes and asks God to heal. And of course, God says to Moses, I'll heal her, but she has to stay out of camp for 7 days. She has to isolate because she has to pay the price for what she did. And so Moses does defend her, goes to bat for his sister. And we'll look at that portion, by the way, in a few weeks, or a couple months, actually. We'll read that portion before you know it, and we'll go back to this. But yeah, there's a Torah basis for this disease being connected with slander, speaking bad about people, that they would get hit with this disease. So again, Daniela, unfortunately, in your generation, there'd be many young people walking around with some kind of skin disease, because there are way too many people, and grown-ups, by the way. We want to make it very clear. There's a lot of grown-ups that are engaged in slander. I want to make it very clear, slandering people. So
Mark, I remember my parents telling me that in the old country, if somebody spoke of somebody, they would develop what was called a roice, a big red mark on their face. Did you ever hear about that?
That's where this comes from. This comes from the Jewish tradition that your skin would reflect your sin. And so this is the idea that what you said in private, and even if you said it in private, that you'd have there'd be an outward effect to it, which is, again, ironic and very powerful, that the words that you say in privacy to other people will come back and hit you in public. So, and you'll be punished in public. Everyone will see that you did it. So it's a really interesting punishment from that. And, look, Jews are hardly immune from gossip and talking about people behind their back and those kind of things. By the way, if you, again, going back to our show that we originally talked about, Unorthodox, yeah, gossip and slander in very tight knit communities, unfortunately, though a lot of those communities have a lot of good things about them, but the gossip and the discussion about people in those communities is oftentimes really traumatic. They didn't talk so much about that in the movie. They did talk about it, but in her book and in her writings and discussions, she talks a lot about the lack of privacy that people have in an ultra-Orthodox community. And it is something that people really don't like. I mean, it's a trade-off. I mean, one would say that there's also a lot of support and close, you never suffer in isolation and silence. If you're going through something difficult, you'll have a lot of people helping you. On the other hand, they'll be up in your business. So those are things to remember. That these are values, as Hal says. We did not give up on this idea that there is a consequence, and it's meant to scare people. It's meant to scare people from gossiping. I'm glad we got to, even in the midst of these kind of things that we touched on that. Yes.
Yeah, this is Philip. This is sort of the reverse of this, but at common law, and there's law in California, of course, on this, the one area of gossip or slander or libel that you have no defense on is if you say somebody has a social disease, which would be anything from venereal disease to HIV or AIDS or whatever. And if it's not true, that is what's called slander or libel per se, and you have no defense. You can't say, oh, I was only joking or I was only being mean. You are liable.
Really?
That's true of slander and libel in general, isn't it?
No, because
The truth would be a defense. So what is it?
It's a defense, but there's something called libel per se and slander per se, and those you would have no defense other than the truth. There could be other, like if you're, a good example would be journalism. If you're going to sue a newspaper or a news organization, you have to prove malice,
Right.
aforethought, which is very high standard.
Correct.
But you don't have to do that if they said you had a social disease.
Interesting.
And that's in statute. That's in code.
It may have, I don't recall if it's in the code, but it's common law. It's appellate law. Yes.
That's really interesting. And you've had an interesting take on these issues of libel, because you've been both a journalist and a lawyer.
Yes. And I had a client once in my law practice, a former client of mine came back to me and she was crying because she said she was in a lot of trouble. And I said, what trouble are you in? And she said, well, I broke up with my boyfriend and I was angry and I accused him. He had a new girlfriend. So I wrote her a letter and I said that he had AIDS.
She put it in writing. She didn't just say it. She actually put it in writing.
Boom.
Boom.
She had no defense.
Wow. Well, I did not know that. I
got her out of a really bad situation, but she did have to pay some money. Could have been worse.
I'm glad you told me that. I am glad that I know that now. I hope I never need to know that. But
well, it's common law, Mark. I think you may be protected from.
I hope I'm never on either end.
But I'm wondering, with COVID, is not a sexual transmitted disease, but if someone accused someone publicly of having COVID-19 and they did not, I think we'll see litigation around that.
I think we will. Yeah. I think the word sexual will be dropped, and I think it'll be regarding this. Yeah.
Yes.
So it's an interesting idea, and again, I thank you, Daniela, for bringing it back into the discussion of the fact that this disease in itself can be a source of gossip and a source of essentially generating more problems and one would say disease. But again, the Torah is understanding the responsibility, the effect that it has on the entire community. So I do want to, before we wrap up, I want to finish up with some other parts of this Torah portion too, which are interesting because it says that this this eruption occurs in cloth and in wool, a cloth of wool and in fabric, linen fabric. So this is not a disease that just affects of skin.
That's
but,
correct, Francine.
Francine just put out, before we
That's
move
correct.
on,
Yes, she's correct.
libel per se, broadcast or written publication of a false statement about another, which accuses a person of a crime, immoral action, the inability to perform their profession, having a loathsome disease or dishonesty in business.
The key word is per se. It means on its face. So it's already been established
Yeah.
on its face. Yeah.
Yep. Yep. All right. Interesting. I have to keep that in mind. It might be relevant in my life too. Anyways, not the last part. So when this disease would, when they were dealing with this disease in the Torah, this is a disease that also affected clothing, which, by the way, it does affect this current disease also can live in the clothing. So we know that, you'd have to essentially, again, share a mask with somebody that had the disease, or have some kind of contact with the cloth that would put it in an opening, where you'd be exposed to it. But it does, and this disease, whatever it was, or whatever the basis for it is, could be passed by this and by clothing. And again, we're going to see also, so it says in the warp or the woof, the priest would look at the clothing. I also want to point out too that there might be a few diseases. Part of the difficulty in figuring out what the diseases are that they're talking about is it probably is diseases. It's not one form of something that, it was in the clothing and also there and on the skin, and we're not done yet. Where else it could be, but it could be that they were discussed that this is actually there were a few different things that might have been grouped together. So the priest shall look at the articles, shall isolate the affected article for 7 days. On the 7th day, he shall examine the affection. If the affection has spread in the cloth, whether in the warp or in the woof or in the skin, for whatever purpose the skin may be used, the affection is a malignant eruption, it is unclean. The cloth, whether warp or woof, in wool or linen or any article of skin, again, that would be tan skins, in which the affection is found, shall be burned, for it is a malignant eruption. It shall be consumed in fire. This is a serious deal. People didn't want to lose their stuff, and they didn't have as much stuff as we do. So losing their stuff was a serious issue. They burned it. But if the priest sees the affection in the cloth, whether in the warp or woof or in the article of skin, has not spread. So again, they could like draw a circle or draw around the thing, and if it hasn't moved out of that circle, the priest shall order the affected article washed. He shall isolate it for another 7 days. And if after the affected article has been washed, the priest sees that the affection has not changed, and it has not spread, it is unclean. It shall be consumed in fire. It is a fret, whether on its inner side or on its outer side. But if the priest sees the affected part after it's been washed and is faded, he shall tear it out from the cloth and skin, whether in the warp or woof. And if it occurs again in the cloth, whether in the warp or woof, and in any article, it is a wild growth. The affected article shall be consumed by fire. If, however, the affection disappears from the cloth, warp or woof, or from any article of skin is washed, it shall be washed again, and it shall be clean. Such is the procedure for any eruptive affections of cloth, wool, or linen. How do you make it clean? Now, again, it's basically saying it's probably not something you should take for granted, but it's really interesting because you and I would say by today's standards, if you knew something was affected with some kind of disease, you'd throw it away, you'd toss it away. You wouldn't pass go. You'd get it right out of your house and you'd want it away. But that's because we live in a disposable society where most of us don't think twice about getting a new garment if we have a stain on it, let alone an eruption or something pretty gross that's a fungus or something that's spreading in it. But they really didn't have that ability in the ancient world, and quite frankly, up until just a few generations ago, to do this. So, when we talk about, clothing, and we're reading this and you go, well, why just burn it, get rid of it? It just was not a society that could just do away with stuff. It's interesting because you and I, when we lose somebody today, we oftentimes take a ribbon and we rip it and put it on our clothes. But in the ancient world, they didn't do that. And not even in the ancient world, there are a lot of people today who will literally tear their clothes. They'll say a ribbon is not enough. Now, if we tear clothes today, and I had to do this a couple years ago, I took a shirt that I wasn't going to wear anymore and I tore it and I wore that shirt. But I threw it away. I didn't have to. In the ancient world, and again, for those today, you can take your clothing that you've ripped for your relative who's passed away and sew it back up. Now, many of us would say, I would never want to do that because I don't want to wear something that I tore. But we have the ability to discard clothing that we just don't even like anymore. People didn't do that in the ancient world. They did not toss garments away without a deep concern for the value that garment had. So, it seems a little funny that they'd have this discussion about, hey, can we salvage this thing? They seem really cheap about it. No, because they didn't have as much materials as we do today, as much stuff as we do. So it continues on, and this is actually where the next portion begins. Chapter 14 is where Metzora, the next portion, which again is sometimes read as a separate portion. Here's where we get to back to what happens to the person and what happens to them when they go through their cleansing. And so here it says, this is the ritual for a person when he is cleansed. The priest shall go outside to the camp. If the priest sees that the leper has been healed of his scaly affection, the priest shall order 2 live clean birds, cedar wood, crimson stuff, and hyssop, to be brought for him who is to be cleansed. The priest shall order one of the birds slaughtered over fresh water in an earthen vessel. And he shall take the live bird along with the cedar wood, the crimson stuff, and the hyssop. And the reason that crimson stuff is just crimson stuff is because we don't know. It says something that's crimson. It doesn't say what that stuff is. Dip it together with the live bird in the blood of the bird that has been slaughtered over the fresh water. He shall then sprinkle it 7 times on him who has been cleansed of the eruption and cleanse him. And he shall set the live bird free in the open country, a lot like the scapegoat that we release. So there's this idea that getting rid of something is also a way of kind of affecting a cleansing, that there's an animal that cleanses us by taking whatever we need away and out of the camp. The one who shall be cleansed shall wash his clothes, shave off his hair, bathe in water, and he shall be clean. After that, he may enter the camp, but he must remain outside his tent for 7 days. So where was he the rest of this time? He was in some kind of area. And again, when the Torah is talking about this, we're talking about times that people lived in tents. When people are no longer living in tents, we have a description of what happened to them. That they went outside of the city, they lived in a house, they lived in an area, maybe even, unfortunately, they had to live outside. But they go outside of the area. There's no question that they don't live amongst, they are not living amongst the community. They're not living in a public area. Unfortunately, how far away they went, by our standards today, they probably didn't go far enough away that they are keeping people necessarily completely safe. When we had actual leper colonies, as you know, we kept the people really, really far away. Like a Hawaiian island where nobody else could come far away. Leper colonies were serious. It was a serious business, and people were kept really, really far away. These people, in their being outside of their city, outside of the main part of the camp, we're probably not that far away. And most likely, again, they were in areas where they were able to maybe be with other people who were suffering with this illness, which probably didn't help their ability to be cured. Because if you're quarantining with people who all have a disease, you may not have had the disease when you went into quarantine, but you do now. And so this is a real problem that for a long time, if people were misdiagnosed and put with people who were ill, even if they hadn't been ill in the first place, they were going to be ill.
Mark, what were people in quarantine to do about ritual and Shabbat and prayer and minyan?
So we know that the community had an obligation to provide for them. It doesn't seem like that was really, bless you, was a very high level, but the community did have to provide for those people. They were clearly on the margins of society. The bigger question is, what happened to the people? Well, our minds immediately go to the people who would eventually be able to come back into the community. What happened to the people who don't get to come back into the community? What happens to the people who aren't healed? Because we don't get a lot in the Torah about what happens to those people. How do those people keep, like you said, how do they keep Jewish law? How do they keep tradition? How do they stay part of a community if they're ill and they're no longer allowed to be part of the community because they have a disease? Now, the sad fact is that people probably did not live long with some of these diseases, but we do have texts about, and not in the Torah, but later on in the Bible, we have texts about people who are not allowed to live in the community. They're not allowed to live in the city. And the Haftarah, the section of the prophets that we read every year when we read this Torah portion, the Haftarah for this portion comes from the book of Kings, and it tells us about a group of lepers who are living outside of the community, and ironically, they get to be the heroes of the story. But they're the heroes of the story precisely because they are living on the margins of the community, that they're not allowed to be part of the community. When we, again, to remind those, and again, Daniela is not old enough to remember this, but when we were dealing at the height of the AIDS epidemic, or not even at the height, but as the AIDS epidemic was becoming very real in this country and in this world, we were discussing how to quarantine people with AIDS. How are we going to segment them from society? And these were real discussions that we were having in this country. People have forgotten this. I mean, many people don't know it because it's not a part that we like to remind ourselves of. But there were real discussions going on at the highest levels of government. How are we going to segregate people from our society? And the argument was one of real fear. We know in this disease right now, or we believe that a cure is on the horizon. But when we were in the midst of the AIDS epidemic, we did not. I mean, reality, we haven't had the types of disease of vaccines for this disease, for HIV, until the last 5-10 years. So these were real fears. Forget by the time in the late 90s, we had cocktails that cured people, or at least allowed them, not cured, but allowed them to, in the first stage, to live with the disease. But we were very scared. I remember the first person that I knew who was HIV positive. She had AIDS. I mean, we didn't even call it HIV at the time. She was a friend of my sister. She was a Jewish woman in the San Fernando Valley who was a suburban Jewish mother who got it from a blood transfusion. and who my sister was very close with the family and was over at the house all the time. And I remember in the early 80s telling my mother, I don't want her going over there anymore. I mean, this was early on. I mean, I'm admitting something that was not not looking back on it, not my finest hour, but I didn't want her going over to that house. We didn't know. I said to my mom, I said, what if she's going to get it from eating off their plates, and I didn't just think it, I said it. I look back on it now and I'm embarrassed. And actually 10 years later, I was working every week at an AIDS day treatment program in Brooklyn, in downtown Brooklyn, working and trying to keep people at least happy and spiritually connected while they were living, and at that time in 1994, 95, dying with AIDS. It was only kind of a matter of time that these people were looking at their timetables dying. And I no longer by that period was afraid of catching HIV, but it was, in some ways, it was kind of my penance for my ignorance and for my fears 10 years before. But I was
Rabbi?
very, very afraid.
Rabbi?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's Philip Wasserman. In 1986, when I was a field producer for NBC Network News, I produced a story about the late Dr. Tom Waddell, who was a former Olympic athlete, and he was dying of AIDS. He was the man who created the Gay Olympics. And anyway, I had a really hard time finding a camera crew who would go with me to interview Dr. Waddell. And I had people who were in the news bureau in LA who thought I was crazy going up to San Francisco to do the story. And I think they, were even worried. I thought maybe they would shun me when I came back. I didn't know.
Yeah.
We all went through that at that time.
My fears were in 1984. I remember exactly that it was 1984, 85. So this was early on, but I look back on it now and I was very, very afraid. And I look back on it and I'm embarrassed by it, but I mean, this was early on, and she died so quickly, and so it was so frightening. And it was not a gay issue. I mean, it was not a sexually transmitted issue. It was not a lifestyle. I mean, it was literally the best example of why would you be afraid? It was literally a textbook. I won't say it was Ryan White, but for me, that was before there was even a Ryan White. It was my first experience with it. So, yeah.
We all went through that. The media was doing that. The president at the time was doing that. We all felt that. Honestly, we did. Growing up in San Francisco, oh my gosh, there were neighborhoods we wouldn't go to.
Yeah, that's true, Hal. I forgot you were in the Bay Area.
Yeah.
Period.
We just wouldn't go in San Francisco, and we wouldn't go. It's terrible to say, we wouldn't go into the Castro district because, which is predominantly gay, because it was thought to be a gay disease.
And then there's a few of us, this is Mike Schwartz, that I worked in healthcare. I paid medical claims back in the early 80s, mid 80s. And I understood it from the beginning, actually. I had a patient that I dealt with. I talked to the nurses and the doctors, and I knew exactly what was going on. And I didn't have a problem with anybody that had AIDS. I mean, we had a gentleman at work that had it, and I just went up and gave him a hug. No one else would.
How early on was that? How early were you?
I started at Prudential at 82, so I'm talking 83, 84.
Oh. Well, you must have, you were far holier than me, because I'm telling you.
There were papers that went around, from doctors, written by doctors, and I talked to the patient's nurses, and his doctor, and I understood it. He said, "Don't be afraid."
Yeah, I know that early on in the first year or two, there was so much fear and there was so much unknown that, and there really was. I mean, they talk about how, they didn't even know whether it was a virus at first. It was originally, they thought it was a sarcoma. Look, all I can tell you is we know we've been there in a point where we're really, really afraid. And again, we are afraid now, but we understand that this is also a transmittable disease. That's the difference between AIDS. And so today it's much closer to what we're dealing with in the Torah, which is Tzara'at, which is a transmittable, communicable disease, which AIDS was. But we understand now that there was a whole barrier that had to be crossed in order to get it. And so I think for us, what was so powerful about this Torah portion with regards to AIDS was this feeling that we had, especially in the Jewish community, where there was so much prejudice and so much religious, animosity towards the gay community, that there was something that kind of hit us as Jews, because we have, this is our Torah, and yet this gay plague type of atmosphere that we were in was really something that made most Jewish people feel really, really uncomfortable. And the fact that the Torah is essentially a book which is trying to keep us alive, but at the same time trying to lead us into behavior that was not going to damage us. And we recognize that there are 2 lines in the Torah that are homophobic, but they've been explained, they've been understood by gay Jews and gay readers of the Bible for a long time now. And it was problematic, because there are other parts of Leviticus that we're going to read very soon, and we'll get to them, I promise, where we're going to actually read about homosexuality, or at least transvestism, and people, will invoke those. We've talked about it a little bit last week. As we said, it's the same words that we use for kashrut. So again, as we wrap up tonight, I just want to tell you that this is, the whole night we've been thinking about nothing other than our own situation, our own world. I do want to finish with one last part of this, and from the very end of this portion. Actually, I kind of wanted to let people know that, and again, this is the last parts of this Torah portion, which have to do with discharges and other things that are not necessarily the disease. There are ways of cleansing people, and it says women who have a discharge also would have to go through this this cleansing. It actually comes back on itself, and it comes back to what this is all about. At the very end, last 3 verses, you shall put the Israelites on guard against their uncleanness, cleanness, their tuma, their being in an unclean state, lest they die through this state by defiling my tabernacle which is among them. Such is the ritual concerning him who has discharge, concerning him who has an emission of semen and becomes unclean thereby, and concerning her who is a menstrual infirmity. It's a horrible translation, but it is the person who is in the process of menstruating, and concerning anyone male or female who has a discharge, and concerning a man who lies with an unclean woman. It began with the laws for a woman, and a woman in childbirth in particular, and by the end of it, it gets to men and women. And the fact that this Torah portion isn't just concerned with the state for women. It's not just concerned with skin disease. It's not just concerned with diseases that affected clothing, and we kind of skipped over it, but buildings could even have this disease in it. But
I'm still here.
People are,
No, I'm still here.
people are going to be, the Torah is most concerned with keeping people alive. What does it say? You shall put the Israelites on guard lest they die. The whole purpose of this is to keep people alive. Now, again, part of this is that there's a spiritual component to it, that going into the tabernacle in a state of tameh, in a sense of being unclean or impure, that will kill them. But there is this understanding, this underlying understanding that even the things that we don't understand about illness, about disease, about life, which essentially we still say it's kind of in God's hands. The Torah is most concerned with keeping you alive. These laws are not meant to make women feel unclean. They're not meant with making men feel unclean. They're not meant to keep people who are ill to feel unclean. They're about keeping people alive. We said it numerous times about keeping society healthy as a whole, that the needs of the society take precedence. That at the end of the day, our community needs to be healthy. And as Spock said, the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few, right? The person who is, if you have a chance to save people's lives by taking yourself out of the community and removing yourself from the population, that's a holy act in itself. That protecting your neighbors is sometimes one of the highest mitzvahs, because you're keeping people alive. And I really want
protecting your neighbors by reporting your neighbors. We may be heading in that direction.
Listen, the Torah doesn't minimize that or take that off the table. But
Right.
Most importantly, we're meant to live. And again, if we're all dead, it doesn't matter whether you have a civil right, because you're dead. And the Torah is telling you that's what takes precedence. The community's safety and security, the community's life, and in essence, more lives than your lives, we have to help those people. And again, how many people would you give up your life to save? I mean, that's not a question that many of us ever have to ask. But the Torah does put that in front of us. It does put us into this situation where even if our lives are in jeopardy, that sometimes we have to give up our life to save other people's lives. And we just came out of the Holocaust Remembrance Day yesterday. There were more than many hundreds, thousands of occasions where people gave up their lives for other people. Sometimes they did it for their family, as you heard Margot tell her story, that her grandparents gave up their lives because her grandparents were the ones who got the visas, and they ended up giving them to Margot's parents and to Margot. But there were other cases of strangers saving other people's lives, giving people visas and passes that they could have used themselves, that they gave to people that weren't their family members. And there's other cases of people who knowingly gave other people a pass not to go to a death camp. How many people do you save? How many, but it happens. And the Torah tells us that sometimes we have to give up our lives to save other people. And again, how many people doesn't say specifically. We do have a principle elsewhere in the Torah that you can't exchange one life for another. One life is not holier than another life. But is it 2 lives? Is it 3 lives? Hopefully we'll never have to answer that question, but Judaism does recognize that sometimes lives take precedence over a life.
May I share just a quick story about a quick Holocaust story? So when my parents were in the DP camps after liberation, they were preparing to either go to Israel or the United States. They ended up going to the United States, to San Francisco. Women had to give a urine sample to prove that they were healthy. And my mother had been ill, even in the DP camp, after my sister was born in the camp. They came when my sister was 2 years old.
Wow.
And my mother would not, she knew that she would not be able to join my father and her daughter in immigration. there was a woman in the camp she barely knew, almost a complete stranger, who said, I'm healthy, here is my urine sample. You take that and you say that's from you. And my mother did, and it passed, and it was found by the Allies. But the Allies also had others involved with them, and it was found that that woman had done that, and she was not allowed to immigrate.
Wow.
She was not allowed to immigrate. So this woman actually gave a urine specimen to my mother, so my mother would be able to immigrate. They were on the verge of immigration. It was the last step. Isn't that something?
Wow. Do you know what happened to that woman later?
So, they didn't immigrate right away. I think it took another 2-3 months. The woman was taken to another DP camp. In essence, she was punished for this. Listen, they didn't want people coming from the camps after being or coming from the DP camps after being in the concentration camps to the U.S., to Israel, to the UK, to Canada. They just didn't want that. They were trying to do testing. You want to talk about being concerned about disease. These were survivors of the concentration camps, and they were afraid that these people had every illness that there was. You're going to put them on a ship and send them to all the countries of the world. So the Allies did try and do some selection.
Yeah.
Right. And so my mother kept saying this until it left her memory, but we always knew this, that this woman I think she sacrificed herself, or she had difficulty immigrating, and she probably would have immigrated rapidly had she not done this for my mother.
Wow. No, that's a really amazing story. And again, I will tell you that, Hal's, having the story of his parents in the DP camp, it's amazing. And your sister, it's amazing how many children were born in the DP camps.
All of my sister's friends at her age, she's 70, I'll be 64, by the way, in 5 days. In 4 days. In 4 days, on the 27th. All of her friends were all 2 or 3 years old when they left the DP camps. They were born there. And it's amazing these women were able to conceive. Well, many couldn't because they'd been experimenting.
That's the thing. It's a miracle. I mean, it's like literally unanswerable miracle that people physically who survived the camps, who people thought were going to die anyways because they were so sick, that within less than a year in some cases, 46, 47 were having children. It's unbelievable.
Unbelievable.
It is a testament. And my dad has some friends who were one of them ended up becoming a pretty successful Hollywood producer, born in DP camps, who literally, I mean, they came to this country with nothing and with hope. And think about what a testament to hope that people had children in the face of that illness, of that disease and that illness, of that degradation, of that almost not even being alive, that they gave birth out of that and started another generation. That's
right. You know, Mark, my father, just very briefly, Sarah Horn and I were talking about this. You saw my father's tape, but I came across another tape that you haven't seen. Adam actually found it. I'll send it to you. Sarah watched it last night. She couldn't believe it. My father was talking about that. He was talking about how amazing it was after what they went through that they could start another generation. And they strived for that. And they were ill and they were weak. They were getting better. I mean, they were eating and they had medical care. But my father did talk about that. And that reminded me about that tape. And I do want to send you that. I'll send it to you tonight.
Can I share it out with other people?
You may share it with anybody. Yes. Is the one you saw the Shoah tape, or the one that was done in San Francisco in 1989 at Beth Jacob in Oakland, at Beth Jacob congregation? I don't think you saw that one. You saw the Shoah tape.
I saw the one that's part of the Spielberg.
Right. So I'll send you this one because I have been passing it around. I'll send it to you. I'm sorry to interject that, but
no, thank you, and thank you Al for sharing that. It's a great way to...
And he spoke about the Torah, and he spoke about what the Torah. We didn't know my father was well versed in this. Honestly, we didn't. And he spoke about the Torah and what the Holocaust meant in relation to the Torah. Mark, you're gonna find this amazing.
I can't wait to see it. And thanks for sharing that, Hal, because again, it reminds us of hope.
Thank you, everybody.
Happy birthday, and happy birthday to Mike Schwartz, everybody. For
Happy
those who weren't here at the beginning, Mike
Yay.
Schwartz's
And
birthday.
next week, Rabbi, next week is my Torah portion. 48 years ago.
Amazing.
Leviticus 16.
We're going to make you read it. Achrei Mot.
Duh.
Achrei Mot.
There you go.
All right, everybody. We'll see you. Stay healthy. And again, join us Friday night for services. We're going to have some special songs for Yom HaShoah too. But also, we're going to remind people next Tuesday night is our special Yom HaTzmaut for hope as well. So please join us for that too. Take care, everybody. Stay healthy.
Thanks, Mark. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Good night.